Thank you very much. Is that working now? Yeah. Thank you for coming. And I'm going to give a rather unusual kind of talk because thinking about this, I thought this is an occasion to be a little bit reflective, almost philosophical, about the nature of an archive and the nature of a library indeed, and of course about the role of a literary executor. So really, although it's called an introduction to the archive, it's really more reflections on the archive seen from after a number of years. And I shall be talking to a PowerPoint, so I'm going to just begin by, I'll begin with the first few items are simply photographs. Let's see if I can. Now the first photograph was taken by Caroline, who's here today, Professor Hawkes' third daughter, and it's a very beautiful picture of David in his study in Oxford during the years when he was translating the story of the Sun, Hong Amang. And it's a lovely picture because of the way the light comes in through the window, and also because it shows some of his library there. His library was quite a special kind of library, which he built up himself over a number of years, beginning when he was at Beidou in 1948. And then late in life, he decided he would never translate any more Chinese, so he gave the whole library to the National Library of Wales. So in a sense, that was the first donation in this long story. And later he regretted having given it to the National Library of Wales because he decided actually he would like to do some more Chinese anyway. And he had to go and steal his own dictionary from the library because you're not supposed to tell them that, but I mean, the dictionary, Matthew's dictionary, which was part of his library, was in the National Library of Wales, and one day he just went there and took it because he needed it so badly. Anyway, that's a bit of a secret story, but that copy of Matthew's is now in the possession of one of my students, so it gets handed down. And that's one of the themes of my talk, is the way things get handed down, the way they get preserved, the wonderful role of libraries. I mean, libraries are the great bastion of civilization. They're what keeps things alive, you know. And I've been involved with several libraries which have basically spent years getting rid of books, you know. It's a shameful thing for them to do, but they're doing it all over the world. And I have to say, I hugely respect this library. I've known this library since 1982. It's a very great library. I say great, very, very advisedly. It's a very fine library, this. And I've had occasion to use it many, many times. And it does a wonderful job. And in the case of this archive, it's doing a wonderful job. As I said earlier on in my very brief introductory words, the translator exists between worlds. We all do. Every translator exists between two worlds. We live in a kind of a bilingual, bicultural universe. It's a very hard world to live in, actually. You never know which language you're going to wake up in the morning, you know. Whether you're going to be Chinese or English or French or, you know. But that's what translators are. They're a very peculiar breed. Very few people are actually suited to the work of translation. You have to be a little bit schizophrenic. You have to be able to live balancing between two worlds and always thinking, how would that go in the other language, you know? It's almost an obsession. Translators are a very peculiar breed, and David Hawkes was no exception. And you see, this is the real world in which he lived, in the mid-Wales. It's a very, very beautiful part of Great Britain. It's very untouched, very pristine, and very beautiful. And in his later years, he moved to live there. He moved from Oxford to live in an old farmhouse there. And this, of course, is the world of Hong Lamong. This is the garden, the Da Guanyuan, the garden of Hong Lamong. And David Hawkes lived between those two worlds. In fact, really between Oxford as well. But he was constantly balancing his life between these two worlds. I'm just going to flick through these photographs because it helps. You've seen these in the exhibition, but it helps you to get some historical perspective. He began as a young student in China when the Civil War was entering its last years. He very bravely went out there. His letter of application to become what they called Yenjiusheng at Beida had been sitting on Hu Shi. Hu Shi was the Xiaozhang of Beida, and his letter had been sitting there. He wrote 2 or 3 letters, and Hu Shi was famous for never opening his mail. He just left it on the desk. And luckily for David, William Empson, who was a very distinguished English poet, was teaching at Beida, and he spotted these letters, and he drew the attention of Hu Shi to this young man from England who wanted to come out. And as a result, as Caroline said earlier today, David ended up at Beida and had some of the most distinguished teachers actually at the time, including the great Honglamong scholar Yu Pingbo. But Yu Pingbo, David said in one of his interviews that he could hardly understand a word that Yu Pingbo spoke because he had a very strong Zhejiang accent, you know. And also David at that time didn't know much about Honglamong, but anyway, Yu Pingbo was one of his teachers, and so many other famous people. He was a very dashing-looking young man. You can see he looks a bit like a film star, you know. I mean, that one looks like James Dean, and this one looks like, you know, another of the people from that time. And that's where he married his very beautiful wife Jean, and where he mingled with William Enson's family. Here they are having a picnic, William and Hetta and the children, and that's where he got married, and they had a big party in the British legation. So that's just by way of introducing the man, because to get to an archive, you have to go through a whole life. I mean, an archive is a kind of it's almost like a tomb, you know. Yeah, but to get to an archive, basically, the person has to have either lived a long life or to be actually dead. And when they talk about creating an archive for me, I'm terrified I'll be dead before they do it, you know. So I'll try and keep alive lifelong. Anyway, I'll do my best. And meanwhile, so what happens is that when someone reaches towards the end of their life, they start to think about what they call last things. And David had a whole box file entitled Last Things. And one of the last things, of course, is to write your will, your last will and testament, in which you say, I leave all my belongings to my 3 dogs, or whatever, you know. That's your last will. And David wrote his last will. He also changed it several times, and eventually he named me as his literary executor. We had been long-time friends and collaborators, and I had married into his family. I married his oldest daughter, Rachel, and we were very, very close. And it seemed only natural for him that he should name me as his literary executor. But even there's a story, which I will touch on briefly. So this is his will. I'm not going to show you the whole thing, because it's probably... but in his will, late in his life, he wrote a codicil. That's an amendment to his will, in the year 2004, in which he appointed me to be his literary executor. So this is a fact. This is a legal fact. And I have to emphasize this because people have no idea what's involved. It's actually quite an onerous task. You have to accept a responsibility for somebody's life work, you know. And I did this. I did it with some reluctance, but I did it. And it's partly as a result of that I've been involved in this very fine exhibition with the team, you know, with Lai Feng and George and Anthony and all the wonderful people who've put this exhibition together. Excuse me. So there's a document. I don't think there's a copy of this will in the archive, is there? No. I must give you a copy. It's important that it should be there. I mean, the archive is an ongoing project. Every minute there's a new idea. Every minute there's a new thing, you know. And Caroline discovers some little treasure, you know, and she very kindly gives it, you know. So the archive is it's an organic thing. It's a growing thing. It's a very important fact to remember that. But it all goes back to this decision to have a literary executor, to think about the future, to think about what would happen after his death, after he passes away. And that's what I then had the job of taking on that. And I've given this little extract from a letter that David wrote to me in September 1986. And the letters, there are copies of all his letters in the archive. In this letter, I'd written to David saying, I'd finally finished the 5th volume of the translation. And I wrote him apologizing for my terrible slow progress and saying what a hopeless person I wrote one of my typical, you know, oh David, I'm so terrible, you're wonderful, I'm useless. And he wrote back and said, you know, I'm not going to let you do this, you know, you can't say that. At the bottom, your scholarship is not bogus. Obviously I wrote and said my scholarship was bogus. I still say that kind of thing. And you don't owe me, you don't owe everything to me. I would never have asked you to help me finish the stone if I hadn't thought you the best and most reliable translator I know. And volume 5 triumphantly vindicates that judgment. I keep rereading bits and getting the authentic thrill each time. It was worth waiting for, and I'm so happy and relieved that the misery of waiting no longer makes a black shadow between us. I mean, it's a very personal letter, but I wanted to show it to you because it reflects his decision to make me his chosen heir, in a sense, his literary executor. It's a big decision, and he took that decision, and I've tried to follow through on it, leading, in a sense, to this exhibition today. That's my job, that's my responsibility to this great figure. And at the same time as that was happening, well, earlier actually, in 1975, I was beginning to work on the story of the stone, the last 40 chapters, and I was starting to send my work to Penguins, and I would get replies from the editor, Betty Radici, a very wonderful editor, in the old style of editor. She read every line, she put red and blue marks and everything, and she sent me letters like, this letter is from Betty Radici, is in the archive. And she tore my translation to pieces. She said it was absolutely terrible. I mean, I have to say this. She actually said, you've got to learn to write English, basically. And the last time I saw her was in 1977. On my way to Australia, I went to visit her in London, in the Penguin Books office in the Strand. She came out, and there was a long staircase going up. She stood at the top of the stairs as I waved goodbye to her, and she shouted to me, read Bunyan, young man, read Swift. And this is the old style editor, you know. She told me to go away and read some English, you know, and learn how to write properly. And I was really humiliated by all that, but I learned a huge amount. And all this is deposited in the archive because I think it's important for people to see how these things happen. You know, it's a record, it's a monument, really. I mean, it's quite a big deal, actually, creating an archive. So David died in 2009, at the end of July, and he was 86 years old. After his death, all of his papers passed into my hands, and I came here to Hong Kong in 2011 for a spell as professor in the department. And I brought with me, I can't remember how I managed to bring them, but I brought with me all these papers. And I think I've got photos. Here they are, sitting in my study at Chinese U. In a raw state, just files, boxes, you know, and there they all were. And it occurred to me at that time that I should do something serious with this stuff, you know. I shouldn't just drag it around the world with me and let it get into a mess, you know. So I spoke to my very dear friend Colin Story, who I'd known for some years, who was also a very fine rock musician, actually. He had a great farewell party in Wan Chai, very noisy. Well, he was playing the drums and everybody was dancing on the tables. Anyway, Colin was a great guy. And Colin said, John, why don't we create an archive? And I said, what a great idea. And Colin got really involved. Colin had studied Chinese at Leeds with Bill Jenner. And he was, you know, he was a very interesting man. And he was the one who really got the thing going. And then, I think later that year or the beginning of the next year, he retired and handed over to a very lovely lady called Louise Jones. And Louise entered into the spirit of it. She was very enthusiastic about the archive, and she was the one who was finally in charge here when I brought all those boxes over and handed them over to the library. And it was a wonderful moment in which I felt safe. I felt these papers are now safe. They're in safe hands. And that was like over 10 years ago. And in the intervening 10 years, new people have come on board. And the new staff in the special collections, like Lai Thang George and so on, have lavished care on this archive. To my great joy, I've watched it. As I said, it's an organic thing. It's grown, but it's not just grown, it's also been catalogued with immense care to detail. I mean, every letter has been read, and every letter has had the contents summarized. Letter from David to Robert Hightower, expressing an interest in, raising flowers, and I mean, brief descriptions. And then, not everything has been digitized, but I mean, basically, someone wanting to do the research can come here and then say, I want to look at the letter from Hightower, dated the 17th of December, whatever, and they'll find it, And they've done a fantastic job. I mean, it's a real tribute to the serious nature of this library, the way they've dealt with this archive. I'm so impressed. And as part of that, it then became necessary to trace out the ramifications of David's life and his scholarship. I picked out one man here, Professor Liu Sunren, who became a very close friend over the years, and who wrote letters and letters, letter after letter to David, and they're all in the archive. And this man, who was also made honorary doctor of letters at Hong Kong U and gave the Tianmu lectures here at Chinese U in 2006-07, his letters are now in the archive, and in particular I want to draw attention to one letter. He used to write tiny, tiny characters in classical Chinese, of course. And this letter, which is dated May 1976, is a very historic document, because in this letter he wrote to Professor Hawkes, and he said, I've heard that your Gao Di, your eminent disciple, he referred to me as his Gao Di, your eminent disciple has expressed an interest in coming to Australia. And I was just living in a village outside Oxford, minding my own business, looking after my children and my dog, and starting to translate Hong Lamang. And suddenly Professor Liu emerged out of the clouds like some sort of immortal, and invited me to come to Australia to be his student. And David wrote me a letter saying, I've had a long, rather puzzling letter from Professor Liu of the Australian National University, written in Chinese characters about 1 millimeter high, in which he seems to be wanting to do some sort of good. So basically, these two letters, which are both in the archive, record a turning point, I mean in my life, but also in the whole story of the Hong Lamang translation. Because as a result of Professor Liu inviting me to Australia, I was able to have a period of 3 or 4 years in which I could finish the last 40 chapters of Hong Lamang. So it's all there in the archive is an extraordinary repository of hard information, with dates, with handwritten letters that this is for historians, I mean, I've recently become very good friends with a historian, and I realize that historians have a totally different mindset to translators. Translators play around with words and worlds. And I'm translating Liao Zhai Zhi, fantastic stories, Historians want to know about facts, They want to know about dates. They want to know about things that actually happened, reality. And they're always making reality checks. And in this archive, you've got material for a historian of the translation of Chinese literature. Here's another of Liu's letters written in English this time. Now, if we stop for a moment, and I said this is rather a reflective talk, I think the archive that we've created here, that you've created here in Chinese U, is a superb success story. I think it's marvelous. It's going to go on getting better and better, but it's already marvelous. Sometimes archives fail. Sometimes they don't happen, And the case I'm going to give to you is the case of Arthur Waley, because this is a tragic example of how a great figure, I mean, if there are two great figures in the translation of Chinese literature in the 20th century, they are Arthur Waley and David Hawkes. And Arthur Waley was a different kind of translator, but also very brilliant. And when Arthur Waley died in June 1966, he had named David Hawkes as his literary executor in his will. So David became his literary executor. And David knew that Arthur Waley had lots of unfinished translations and papers and all letters and all kinds of things. And he did his best to try to find them. He spoke to Waley's widow, Alison Robbins. She insisted that everything had been lost, everything had gone, everything had been stolen, there was nothing left. He kept on saying, well, I know the things, I know the stuff there. No, there's nothing left, it all disappeared. And in the end, he tried his hardest to do his job as literary executor, and in the end he had to give up, because she wouldn't agree to show him anything. She said, there's nothing left. And in the end he gave away his role as literary executor for £1 on the advice of his lawyer. He gave it back to Alison, to the widow. And he said, I can do no more. And that was the end of his role as literary executor, because he was no longer literary executor. And then Alison, the widow, and her son by a previous marriage, John Robinson, took over. They took over the managing of the Waley estate. And believe me, they certainly managed it, because they used to charge about £10 a word to reprint any of Waley's translations. I know that from my own personal experience with Chinese University Press. When I published the Anthology of Translations in 2000, we wanted to have Waley translations. We had to pay £10 per word to have his poems in there. Luckily, my colleague Joseph Lau, Liu Xiaoming, raised the money from some of his wealthy Hong Kong friends, several £1,000s, to pay for Waley. So it was like an industry. But there was no archive, there was nothing to see in terms of his documents. Now, after David died in 2009, and I know this confidentially, all of Waley's papers, hundreds and hundreds of letters and documents, which Alison said had all disappeared. They were offered to an antiquarian bookseller in New York, but they wanted £2 million for them. And the bookseller said, no, that's too much. So then they put the whole lot up for auction with Christie's in 2011. So all of the papers that were supposed to be stolen and no longer existing were put up for sale at Christie's. This is Arthur Waley. And this is a very rare photograph of David sitting with Waley. They were very close. And this is a little note, which this is in the archive. This is a little note from Waley to David. And this is in the archive. It's a copy of Waley's CUHK, the 9 songs, with an inscription to David, with gratitude from Arthur Waley, February 1955. And this is a brief description of his death. I remember David saying to me, Alison called me up last night. This would have been in June 1966. Alison called him up and said, David, Arthur keeps saying something. He's half asleep. He keeps saying yo tu. I don't know what he means. And David knew yo tu means the dark path. So Waley was thinking of himself going towards death, you know, and he kept saying yo tu. And Alison had no idea what he meant. And the sale took place in 2011. And there were a number of postcards from Beryl de Zoet, his previous lover. They went for £8,000. And then there were all these important collection of letters to Arthur Waley from phonologists and other Oriental scholars, including the wonderful Swiss phonologist Paul Demieville, and 34 letters from David Hawkes, 34 letters, 3 letters from CUHK, and so on and so forth. They went for £157,250. And the scandal is, they were all bought by one person. I never found out the name because Christie's are very, very careful about it. One Chinese investor in Shanghai bought the whole lot. He probably spent about £1 million. He bought all the papers, and they're in a bank vault in Shanghai, and nobody will ever see them. Because he bought them as an investment, because he thought they would increase in value, and I'm sure they have. But that means there is no archive. There is no way of finding out about what was going on in Waley's life. It's all been put in a bank vault. And for me, that's a failure. that's how our archive failed. And thank God we didn't do that. You know. Thank God that when David's widow Jean came out here in 2011, we decided to donate the whole thing to the library. And as a result of that, we've built it up over the years, and it's now an exemplary archive. And in a way, that's the bulk of my talk. I want to talk about the significance of an archive, the significance of a library, and the significance of a literary executor, of creating some continuity in literary history. You know, I think it's terribly important. Okay, well, to look at the archive, I'm going to just whiz through a few details. I don't have much time. It's also, one of the beautiful things about this archive is that it's a record of friendships. You can excavate from the archive the world of friendship of this individual, the people who he treasured as his friends. And there's some remarkable people. For example, you know, Chinese scholars coming here would be fascinated to discover that he was a very good friend of Tian Zhongshu. The extraordinary man Tian Zhongshu, I mean, you know, a real character. And Tian Zhongshu wrote a letter. It's in the exhibition anyway. He wrote this letter because Tian Zhongshu was invited to visit All Souls College. It must have been about 1981, 82. I've forgotten the exact date. And he wrote a letter to David. Starts off by saying, 可是先生, right? 导师, right? So he wrote this letter in classical Chinese, and he inscribed it in his rather lovely calligraphy. And he sent it to David, basically saying, I'm sorry, I can't accept the invitation to come to Oxford. And what's so wonderful is that David then translated it into English. He wrote a fantastic translation with footnotes. He was basically making fun of Tian Zhongshu. He thought Tian Zhongshu was basically much too clever for his own good, you know. Tian Zhongshu was always showing off, you know. He couldn't stop showing off. David's favourite story about Tian Zhongshu was Tian Zhongshu came back to Oxford from Rome. He'd been to visit the Vatican Library, and he found a musical manuscript there. He was very excited about it. He said today, oh, I found this wonderful piece of music at the Vatican Library. And David said, yeah, yes, he said. But he never told Tian Zhongshu. It was actually the tune of Three Blind Mice, a children's nursery rhyme, you know, Three Blind Mice. And Tian Zhongshu was so clever, he hadn't noticed that it was Three Blind Mice, but he was very excited about it. So Tian Zhongshu was a hyper-excitable person, and he wrote this lovely letter to David, and David translated it with footnotes, making fun of it, actually. And really, if you read between the lines, he's basically saying, you pretentious man, you know, why couldn't you just write a simple letter saying I can't come? No, that wouldn't have been good enough for Tian Zhongshu. It had to be a kind of showing off thing, you know. Anyway, that's in the archive. That's one of the gems in the archive. And the original calligraphy is in one of the cases upstairs. You can see beautiful calligraphy. I mean, he was a man who really got his calligraphy good, and a great admirer of the Hawke's translation of the stone. And another person, a very important person in David's life, was the scholar Wu Shichang. And Wu Shichang was at Oxford for many years. He published his first book on Hong Lameng in Oxford, in English, at the Oxford University Press. And there he is with David as a young, David on the left is a very young, newly appointed Oxford Don, the Professor Homer Dobbs, an American missionary, and Wu Shichang on the right. Wu Shichang was a very fine scholar. He knew a lot about oracle bones, Zhao Guwen. He could write Chinese poetry quite well. But his real thing was Hong Lameng. He was an archetypal Hong Shui Jiang, fanatical. He was my PhD examiner. I wrote a PhD attacking him, and he very kindly said, I don't agree with a word in your PhD, but I think you make a good case. He was very kind, because I tore his book to pieces. I thought he was very critical of the whole of the last 40 chapters. He wouldn't say a good thing about the last 40 chapters, which is ridiculous, because, I'm sorry, this is one of my hobby horses. Some of the best scenes in Hong Lameng are in the last 40 chapters, you know. I'm not saying the whole thing is good, but there are some of the most amazing scenes in the novel come in the last 40 chapters. You think about Lin Dayu's Nightmare, you know. Think about her playing the Gu Qin. These are some of the great scenes. And I personally believe that some of the sections of the last 40 chapters were actually written by Cao Cui, but I can't prove that. Nobody. Anyway, that's Wu Shichang. Unfortunately, he went back to China just in time for the Cultural Revolution, and it had a terrible effect on him. So here's one of his letters from the archive, and here's a postcard he sent to David from Venice with a little poem he wrote, you know. And then, of course, another of his great friends, this is a very old photograph of him, of Rao Zhongyi. Rao Zhongyi and David went back to the 1960s, you know. They were like, you know, brothers, really. And the third person in that network would have been the Swiss technologist Paul Demieville. And there are many of Rao Zhongyi's letters in the archive. And of course, that wonderful scroll, sorry, the wonderful scroll which is center place of the exhibition, which portrays David as a kind of Chinese hermit, translating Hong Meng in a Chinese landscape. It's one of Rao Zhongyi's greatest paintings, I think, and will remain in the possession of the family, quite rightly so. But maybe one day in the future it will join the archive. That's entirely up to the family, you know. It was one of the great treasures of Mrs. Hawkes, and some of Rao Zhongyi's extraordinary calligraphy. And then, of course, the wonderful lady Fang Zhanlin, who regarded David as her teacher, you know. He wasn't really her teacher, but he was very kind, and he helped her with the truths and so on. And she gave him many, many pieces of calligraphy and paintings. This is actually dedicated to him and his wife, you know, Hawkes Jiao Shou Furen, you know. And then many other people, like the scholar Deng Yunxiang, the wonderful Achilles Fang at Harvard, you know, the Korean who refused to admit he was Korean till his dying day. He always insisted he was Chinese. He wasn't Chinese at all, any more than I am, you know, but he was a very interesting and rather eccentric scholar at Harvard. And he was a great friend of David's. And of course, Yang Xianyi. A lot of people think that David and Yang Xianyi are like, you know, enemies. You know, they weren't. They were good friends, and they were very close. And they were both. And David hated people comparing his translation of Hong Meng with Yang Xianyi's. He hated that. And I mean, we all know his translation was better. We don't even need to argue about it. Xianyi himself said so. And so did his wife Gladys. They couldn't be free. They had the party secretary right behind them, you know, saying, do this, do that, translate word for word, follow this text. Whereas David was completely free. And in fact, on Monday, when I talk about his art of translation, the key word is freedom. But it's the freedom in the sense of St. Augustine's prayer, you know, whom to serve is perfect freedom. He was a dedicated servant of his author, but he also had total freedom. And that will be my theme on Monday. And then his great friend Yang Zhouhan. Yang Zhouhan was a very fine scholar who translated Latin, he translated Virgil, and so on. He was the chairman of the Comparative Literature Association, and he used to come back to Oxford to visit David. I was there once. He always liked to go to Marks and Spencer and buy some new clothes. He had a very fine suit made in Marks and Spencer. Anyway, Yang Zhouhan was one of his correspondents, a very distinguished scholar. And then, to everyone's surprise, one of David's immediate friendships was with the poet Gu Chang. When he came to visit New Zealand, David met Gu Chang, and they sat down together one evening and they wrote poems together. And this original is in the archive. This document talks about a moment in time when two totally different people, an elderly professor from Oxford and a young Hmong poet, you know, met, when their minds met, and the way they met was to write poems to each other, and there the poems are, you know, in the archive, bringing to life an extraordinary detail about David Hawkes, which otherwise might be completely lost. You know, mislay me not, forget me not. That's the point. This is making sure that things are not forgotten, they're not mislaid. And then we come home to Hong Kong and Jinyong, you know, because David very, very generously decided to help me with the translation of Jinyong's last novel, Lu Ling Ji. And in the course of working on that, he he developed his own ideas about Jin Yong as a writer. They were not very complimentary, I have to say. And all his emails and letters about this are in the archive. And indeed letters from Jin Yong, they're also in the archive. And these are his, David's emails to me about Louis Cha as a writer. He had a very low opinion of him as a writer. He thought he was a very lazy, careless, superficial writer. I cannot possibly make any comment. And Glenn Baxter, the Harvard expert in Sun Tzu, and there were letters with him. And the very talented Anglo-Indian writer Vikram Seth. Again, many people don't realize there was a close friendship between Vikram and David. David helped him with his translations of Chinese poetry. And when Vikram Seth wrote that great novel, A Suitable Boy, which is a huge bestseller. And when he was giving a talk once in Brighton, in England, somebody in the audience said, "What inspired you to write A Suitable Boy?" And he, without hesitation, he said, "The Story of the Stone." So Vikram studied Chinese at Nanjing Daxue, but he continued to have a friendship with David. And when David had his 80th birthday in Oxford, Vikram Seth came to the party. Wonderful man. And Arthur Golden, who wrote that book about the geisha, he never got to know David, but he wrote letters to him. Now this is an interesting one that very, very many people wouldn't know about. Donald Mitchell was a great musicologist. He wrote the standard studies of Gustav Mahler, 3-volume biography and study of Mahler's symphonies. And in the course of that, he was studying the famous Lied von der Erde by Mahler, which uses Chinese poems, you know. And he was very curious about it. He wrote to David, "Could you help me with this?" And David just immediately, you know, like the one you showed me, Caroline, about, he would always respond to people saying, "Oh, I've got this old bit of Chinese in my kitchen. What does it mean?" You know, and instead of throwing it away, David would write, "Oh, wait, it means this, this, this." With Donald Mitchell, he had a long correspondence about the poems, and Mitchell wrote back to him. And these are some of David's notes for the Mitchell study of Das Lied von der Erde. And then, of course, his contemporary Burton Watson from Columbia University, who spent most of his life in Japan, they corresponded frequently. They had a lot in common, actually. And here's one of Burton's letters to Hawkes. And also Robert Hightower at Harvard, one of his very close friends over the years. Many, many letters from Hightower. Arthur Cooper was another of his interesting. I mean, I could go on about this forever, but I better carry on. Okay, so you've got this record of friendships. You've also got, because David stored his papers methodically. They had boxes with labels and so on. Something many people don't know is that before embarking on Hung Lameng, David was studying Yuan drama, Yuan Zhaju, and he read every single one of the Yuan plays, every single one. And he wrote a synopsis, he wrote notes on them, and he kept all those notes. They're all in the archive, right? As a document showing that for several years before he suddenly went off and did Hung Lameng, he was working on Yuan drama, because he was always interested in drama, in the theatre. And when you read the translation of Hung Lameng, you'll notice how good he is at writing dialogue, because he had a feel for theatre, you know, had a feel for the stage. He loved the stage, and he loved the Yuan drama. And those notes are all in the archive. And then another fact that's very little known, in 1979, he came to Australia to visit me. And later my wife joined us, but he gave his last ever seminars, a series of 8 seminars on Hung Lameng. And he made very detailed notes for those seminars. And I've given you one of them there. I remember him working really hard, because it was the last time he gave lectures, and he was so nervous. He wrote, there are about 10 notes like this, and they're all in the archive. And they're fascinating, because he translates a lot of interesting stuff. And then Michael Sullivan, who was one of the great art historians, one of the great historians of Chinese art, was a very close friend. And very touchingly, Michael wrote, "For David, one of my heroes, as a scholar, a man, a friend, for 50 years or more. That was when he came to David's 80th birthday in Oxford, Michael Sullivan. This is Palat, who was another translator from, I think, Hungary. Anyway, so you've got all these people whose friendships are recorded in the archive. That's terribly important. I mean, if anyone wants to get to know me, probably the best way is to find out who my friends are and talk to them, you know, and they'll tell them the real picture. You know, John's hopeless at this. John can never, you know, look after his money. John is just crazy about dogs, you know. All the details that add up to a human being. And David's friends would say the same. And then, okay, on a more serious note, there are what I call research materials. You know, for example, this is the early edition of the Schulze translation with all his handwritten corrections, because he brought out a revised edition for Penguin Classics in 1985. And this book has all his handwritten corrections, you know. It's a treasure in the archive. And then there's the translator's notebooks. Now this is a story. When, roughly 1982, David gave me 4 little notebooks that he'd been writing during this translation. He just said, you better have these, John. And then some 10 years later, he wrote back and said, have you still got those old notebooks of mine? Because I'm having to buy a house and I need a bit of money. Would you try and sell them for me? This is real life, you know. It's called money, you know. And so I said, okay, David, of course I've got them. And I sold them for him to Lingnan University because of a friend there called CUHK who was running a center. And they bought them. And I sold, luckily, I said to them, you can buy them on one condition, that you publish a deluxe facsimile edition. Everything reproduced faithfully, the color, everything. So they did. And I say luckily because, much to their shame, they lost it. They lost the original notebooks. They can't find them. It's another unfortunate story about, luckily they produced that facsimile, and the facsimile is in the archive. And in fact, the facsimile is about to be reproduced by commercial press in Peking. Because this, I can't spend time on this, but these notebooks are extraordinary. And one of my friends and students has written a wonderful thesis about these notebooks, going into them in great detail. These are just pages from the notebooks. And then, of course, you've got the other great treasure in the archive is the actual manuscript of the translation. Chapters 2 to 80. Unfortunately, he threw away chapter 1, but otherwise the whole thing is there, and with all his handwritten corrections. I've only given you one page there, but that manuscript is in the archive and has now been digitized and is available online. And one day someone will write a wonderful book about it, but they'll have to have lots of time on their hands, because he changes his mind again and again and again about words, you know. Someone could learn a huge amount from that. Students of translation could learn a huge amount. And then also in the archive are the typescripts of volumes 2 and 3. They were mine, which he gave to me. And I put those in the archive. Unfortunately, I lost the first volume. I don't know where it went to. I'm hoping somewhere, maybe Penguins have kept it, because even in the typescripts, he makes changes. This man did not stop. He was a real perfectionist. So he would have a rough typescript, a good typescript done by a secretary, and then send it off to Penguins. But always correcting things right. And then even when he got the page groups, he'd correct those, you know. And then there are the letters. I've shown you one letter, but all of the letters between Hawkes and myself, copies of those are in the archive. And here I must again mention a detail. All those letters were actually sold to a collector in Taiwan. But he is not a hoarder. He said you can make copies of them and put them in the archive. So they're all in the archive, copies. The originals are actually in a private collector's possession in Taiwan. But every single letter has been copied. for the archive. Oh, I think I've reached the end. Okay, I think that is basically beginning with some reflections, and then just give you a few little snapshots of what's in the archive. And I hope it'll attract what I call intelligent attention, because there's a lot to be learned from it. You know, it's a learning and research. What's the word? Thing. And also it's a living thing. Thank you very much.
Now we are going to have a Q&A session. We welcome any questions related to the David Hawkes archive, and please let us know if you have questions, and our colleague will pass the microphone to you.
Vous pouvez parler français si vous voulez.
D'accord, traduction en français. Yes. Thank you very much for a fascinating talk. And it was interesting to contrast the failed archive and the far more successful archive that is the David Hawkes archive. I wonder whether there were any examples of literary archives that you drew on as good models when you were thinking about how to best curate the Hawkes archive.
I have to confess, no. I mean, I'm a working translator. You know, I'm a drodding translator, really. I mean, I've always loved books like John Sutherland's book on Thackeray at Work, where he looks at the manuscript, and I like the wonderful book The Road to Xanadu, which uses Bristol Library archives about Samuel Taylor Coleridge. So I know about that because of the actual books, but I mean, I'm not a librarian. I'm a hopeless librarian. I mean, I lose books, I mistreat them. One of my dearest friends is always scolding me about the way I treat books. You know, I mean, I eat books like dogs eat bones. You know, and I'm a useless librarian. I just stumbled into this, you know, because of a personal thing, and then I've learned from your colleagues here over the years. I mean, I've been amazed. I've learned a huge amount. I mean, they have catalogued this with such care, you know. And I mean, George knows his way around this archive far better than I do, you know. I mean, you're very, very lucky, and it's been wonderfully. The library has put resources into this over the years, you know, over the past 10 years, and it's grown, as I say, organically. So I've learned now. I've learned from scratch myself. I would be interested now to go and look at other archives, but you know, I'm sure the British Library has some wonderful archives, for example, and of course the Bodleian has fantastic stuff there. But I'm not really a scholar or a librarian. I'm a translator, you know. I just make stuff up, you know, and hope for the best, you know. And you know, but I've learned to respect the thing enormously. I think it's a wonderful thing. I think libraries are the temples of human civilization, and they will never be replaced by, you know, ChatGPT or AI or any of that stuff, you know. And with great respect to some of my friends and colleagues, I mean, digital humanities is wonderful, but it's also always got to be secondary to the raw material, the human material. And the archive, wonderful to digitize it, but the fact is it's there, and that's the important thing. It's been preserved as a human document, you know. And so I've learned as I go along, frankly, and I've still got a lot to learn. There's a huge archive in Bristol, because when Penguins couldn't find room in London, they gave their whole archive to Bristol Library. And it's a mess, frankly. I went there to try and find the stuff relating to the story of the stone. You can find it, but I mean, you've got to really search, you know. There's been no methodical cataloguing, there's been nothing, you know. Probably because nobody funded it, you know. They had more important things to do. But there was a wonderful archive at Bristol about the Imperial Maritime Customs, for example, because somebody must have put money in it. I mean, in the end it comes back to money, you know. As you know, and this is all about money. It's all about what you prioritize, you know, and whether you value such and such a thing, you know. And I hope that this archive will prove to future generations that it's worthwhile, you know, putting care in, and care means money, into this thing, because then it becomes a useful tool. It becomes something that you can actually extract knowledge from, you know, and build build scholarship around, you know, and hopefully give examples to future translators. Because as I'm going to talk on Monday, one of the extraordinary things about Hawkes as a translator is that he's completely crazy. He has no rules whatsoever. He does the most absurd things in his translation. I'll give some examples on Monday, but you know, he'll have some strokes of genius, and he'll have some strokes of sheer eccentricity. And if you skim through it, you don't notice them. There's so many little personal touches that he throws in, you know. I read the translation to my wife when she was very ill, and she kept bursting out in laughter because I could hear my father's voice. And in that piece you quoted today, it's his voice. It's his incredibly refined style of English, because he read everything. If he read Dickens, he read all of Dickens. If he read Henry James, he read all of Henry James. And Meredith, you know, he was just a reader, and he read very intensely, you know, and it shows in his English style. He was an English stylist, you know. So was Arthur Waley. That was similar. They were similar in that respect. And you know, the archive will demonstrate that. You know, you can see from the archive that he was someone who had literary connections. He was a fine scholar too, but he was also a free spirit. You know, on paper, he was a free spirit, and he learned probably more from the poet William Empson than he did from any sinologist. William Empson wrote a very famous book called 7 Types of Ambiguity. And one of the things that David does in his translation is to insert all kinds of ambiguity, you know. And Sarsway Chin was into ambiguity as well, playing with words, you know, having double meanings, triple meanings, and so on. And David really does that too. And you can learn that from the archive. There will be future people coming and writing PhDs based on this archive, I bet you. Probably from China, you know. But I hope also from America and the UK, you know, because the Chinese scholars tend to miss the point. I'm sorry to be rude, but I mean, they don't. Why do they miss the point? Because they don't have the English language skills. They don't see the subtlety. They see mistakes. They see the Chinese, well, oh, it doesn't mean that, it means this, but that's not the point. For example, there was all that fuss about why does David not talk about red all the time? You know, 红楼梦里的红往哪里去了? Where did the red go? You know, it's you know, where have all the flowers gone? You know, I mean, they missed the point. He had a reason for that. He decided red was not going to work in English. You know, he was way above them. You know, and they just lay into him on that level, which is it's like secondary school stuff. You know, but really good scholars can come and look at this and realize here's a master. You know, playing with language, not just language, playing with human experience and universalizing it. You know, he was living and breathing Jia Bao Yu. You know, he would walk down the street and just think like Jia Bao Yu. He wrote to me in letters. You know, I was down at somebody's funeral, as Jia Bao Yu would say. You know, they were all this, that, and the other, and he was thinking, he was identifying with these people, like a theatre director identifies with his actors. You know. Sorry, I'm going way beyond your question, but no, I didn't study archives. I have no background in that. I have background in music, theatre, that kind of stuff, you know. And then I got into Chinese, you know, and very soon became a translator because that's what I enjoy, you know. For me, translating is like playing the piano, really. You have a piece by Chopin, you play it, but you also play yourself, you know. You translate, you also put yourself. That's why when you read that passage, it was David's voice, but it's David's voice impersonating Sarsway Chin's voice, you know. And I mean, they spoke to each other. They dreamt about each other. Probably Sarsway Chin somewhere in this room today, you know, saying, oh yes, that's it. Sorry.
If no one else has got their hands up, I've just got one last question.
Okay.
Because there is a lot of talk of dreams, and you mentioned that, in fact, dreams in your answer just now, but a lot of talk of going from the world of living to the world of dreams in The Story of the Stone. If you had, or do you have a dream about the Hawkes archive and what it might lead to or enable beyond PhD theses? Or
do I dream about it?
do you have any dreams for the
Oh,
archive? For
you
what
don't
it
mean
might be?
do I lie awake at night dreaming about it? No. I mean, I have ambitions for it. I think it has it can be very important because he was a unique translator. I mean, he's not like a kind of I mean, you couldn't, even Burton Watson, you couldn't have such an archive about Burton. A fine translator, but something unique about David. He was out there, and as I say, for me, the key is the spirit of freedom. In his written work, he was glorifying the idea of freedom. And nobody dared to challenge him because he was such a fine scholar. They were just scared of him, you know. I don't think I have a dream in the sense that I think that I wanted to spread this idea of freedom. I wanted to be a case study in how a translator can be free and also accurate, you know, because they are freed by their sense of duty to the author. It's a kind of love thing, you know. That's why I love that poem of St. Augustine's, you know. Teach us so to love thee that we may truly serve thee. Whom to serve is perfect freedom. He's talking to God, but I mean, I'm talking about the translator and his author, you know. Like, I think that's the message. And I think that the archive can convey that message, which it should do, simply because of the nature of the stuff, you know. Then I think it's got a wonderful future.